The next topic we want to tackle in this series is list rendering. List rendering is the process of iterating through data properties, things like arrays and objects within your application, and displaying them on the page. And the way we can accomplish this is using Vue's v-for directive, which works very similarly to JavaScript's for-in statement. So the syntax for it and how we use it is going to be pretty familiar. To walk through some examples of its use, I've got some data set up that we can work with. I've come up with an array of data, an object of data, and also an array of objects that is in the theme of our Flashword application in terms of words and translations of words. It's not something that we're going to be specifically using for this application. This is really just for practice purposes. So if you're following along and you want to get your Flashword example set up like I have it, go ahead and copy these data properties as I have in the notes, and you'll want to bring them into your Flashword application as currently written. And within your data option, you just want to add this at the end in addition to the existing data properties that we've set up. And for our first example, I want to focus in on this array of data, which I've just got a handful of Spanish words within here. And what we want to do is use the v-for directive to iterate through this array and output these words to the page. So coming back to our template, I'm going to add this just at the very end. Doesn't really matter where we're putting it. Like I said, it's for practice. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to set up a unordered list element. And then what I want to do is for each of those words, I want to display a list item with the word. So within this list item, I'm going to add the v-for directive. And I'm going to first come up with an alias that is going to represent the current element we're looking at as we iterate through this array. And the name of our array that we're working with is Spanish words plural. So for the alias, I'm just going to say Spanish word singular. That's going to represent each word as we go through. And then I'm going to use the in keyword and then specify the name of the array we're iterating through, which, like I just said, is Spanish words. All right, then within the list item itself, I will use our text interpolation technique to output each word, which will be represented by this alias. And that should do it. So let's refresh this in the browser. And perfect, there's our list of words. Now expanding on this, if for whatever reason we also needed access to the index position of the array as we're iterating through, we can get that by expanding on our for structure here, where after the alias for the value, we'll come up with an alias for the index. For example, let's call it just index. All right, so now just to show that we have access to this, I'm just going to output it before the word, like so. All right, and there we go. We've got our indexes of the array. So that's a basic example of iterating through an array using the v-for directive. And at this point, I just want to note that I am demonstrating this using list items because that seems like a logical thing for list rendering, but it doesn't have to be a list item. We could do this with any HTML element. For example, I can get rid of the unordered list altogether and just convert this to, say, a paragraph element. All right, we should still see that repeated on the page, but we just have separate paragraphs now. Moving on from arrays, let's talk about iterating through objects. So for this example, we're going to use the word object that I set us up with. You can see this has two keys A and B, where key A is some Spanish word and key B is the English translation. So let's look at how we can iterate through the data within this object. So after our previous example, we'll set up another unordered list with a list item that will attach our v-for directive to. And to begin with, let's just access the values within this object, which is just going to be our two different words. So I'm going to come up with another alias. My instincts say just use the alias word, right? Because that's what our values are. But I don't want to conflict with the fact that the object itself is called word. So just to distinguish from that, I'm going to prefix it with this word. The idea being as we're iterating through this object, this word is going to represent the current word that we're looking at. So we'll say this word in word. And then again, using text interpolation, we'll just output this word. And just to distinguish these examples, let's just throw a heading before each of them. So this was our array example, and this is our object example. All right, so let's preview that. All right, perfect. So we got access to both of those words within our word object. And expanding on this, if we wanted to also access things like the key of this object, which in this case would be A and B, we can get that by adding it after our value alias. We'll just come up with an alias for the key, which I'll just call key. and then we'll output that before the word itself, and I'll just separate it with a colon. And there we go. All right, and then just like our array, if we want to know the index position as we're iterating through, we can also access that. We'll just tack that on as another alias, and again, I'll just call it index, and I will output that before our key. All right, so there's our index, our key, and our value. And then finally, combining these techniques together, we can also work with arrays of objects. And the example I have for that is this array of objects I'm calling words. So the contents of this is an array where we have individual objects, and within each object, we have a word A and a word B, where word A is the word we would hypothetically present to the user, and word B would be the expected answer. And of these examples we've worked with so far, I think this is most representative of the actual kind of data structure we will be looking at when we work with Flashword. So let's make sure we can work through this. Coming back to our template, we'll set up another example. And just like we did with our basic array example, we just want to come up with some alias that's going to represent each value within the array, which in this case is an object. So let's just call it word object. And we're iterating through words. And to start with, let's just output that to the page. So there we go. We can see the full contents of that object. And at that point, because we're just working with an object, if we wanted to get to the individual parts of the object, we could just use our standard JavaScript object notation. So I could do things like word object dot word A, and that would just give me the word A value within that object. All right, and I can access both word A and B if I wanted to. So I could start to put this together, something like the English translation of, and that would output our Spanish word, and then we could output as well our English word. And then finally, because what we're really dealing with here is just an array, just like we did with our initial array example, if we needed things like the index position, we could include that as part of our structure as well. So we would just say word object comma index, and then we could prefix each of these outputting that index. Looking beyond arrays and objects, we can also use the v-for directive to do like a numerical iteration. So for example, let's do this. We'll set up another unordered list. And the alias we'll use, we'll just call it number. And what we're going to iterate through in this case is just going to be some numerical value. So let's say 10. So that's basically the equivalent of just like a regular for loop in JavaScript, where if you needed to do something X amount of times, you could structure it around a number. All right, and then finally, we could also do this for strings. If we had a string and we wanted to iterate through each character in this string, we could set it up in the same fashion. This time I'll change my alias to character, and then I'll give it some string that we want to iterate through. And I'll just say, I don't know, hello world. And we should see each character in this string. Now, I can't really think of why we would use either of these last two examples in our Flashword application, but in the interest of just seeing the things that we could iterate through and putting this v-for directive to use, I did want to include them. And to wrap up this discussion, there's one last thing I want to talk about with list rendering. And that is when we find ourselves wanting to combine the v-for directive with the v-if directive. As an example of this, let's rewind to our array example. And let's just say, hypothetically, we only wanted to display words within our array that were greater than 3 characters long. For example, let's say we incorporated like a difficulty level within the application where you could say only show me, moderate or hard words. So we will exclude any words 3 characters or less. How we might instinctually do this is within our for loop where we're going through our words, we could tack on a v-if directive, and we could say that we only want to render this element if the word that we're currently looking at is greater than 3 characters. So for example, we would say Spanish word, and in JavaScript, the way we can get the length of a word is just using the length method, and we want to see if it's greater than 3. This seems like a really logical approach to this, but what we'll find is when we run this, it's not actually going to work. And not only will it not work, it actually creates an error in our application. You can see it's preventing it from loading. And to see the error, let's bring back our web inspector, go to the console, and we're getting an error telling us it cannot read properties of undefined, and it's trying to get the length. So this is referring to right here where it's trying to get the length of Spanish word. It's telling us it's undefined. And the reason for this is when you combine a v-for and a v-if directive, the v-if directive takes precedence. In other words, this is going to be executed first. And so if this is executed before the v-for, well, this alias Spanish word that we created, it just doesn't exist yet. So that's why this is going to fail. So what we would want to do in this situation is rather than trying to combine these two directives in the same element, we want to separate them out. And I'll show this. So I'll take this v-if and I'll move it to another element that I'll wrap around our content. And in this case, I'm going to take advantage of that template element we were talking about in a previous video because I need something to attach this v-if to, and I don't want to just introduce another element here because I don't want to have like a paragraph and a paragraph, or if I was still dealing with the list items, I wouldn't want to have two list items embedded. Basically, I just need some element I could wrap around the inner content that I could decide to conditionally render. All right, now this is going to work because now that these two things are separate, what will happen is as it's going through the page and rendering it, it's going to process this v-for. It's going to make Spanish word defined so that inside of here, we'll be able to execute our if statement and determine whether or not we should show the current word as we're iterating through. Let's make sure this is working as expected. And much better, we're not getting an error, and you can see our updated array example where we're only seeing the words that are greater than 3 characters long. I think the other words we had in this array were uno and dos, so you could see that those are being excluded. All right, so long story short, when you find yourself in a situation where you want to combine a v-for and a v-if, you can do it, just don't do it on the same element, separate it out into two separate elements. Alternatively, later in the series, we'll be talking about something called computed properties, which is another way that you could handle trying to accomplish something like this. So just kind of put a pin in that in the back of your head. Computed properties, if you're in this situation, that might actually be a better solution. We'll take a look at that later.